The endless prospect hung in the void, like a monument to bureaucratic overconfidence, all gleaming alloy and sensor arrays that could theoretically detect a butterfly's wing beat from 3-star systems away. Theoretically being the operative word, because the ship's crew members of the hierarchy naturally had never encountered a butterfly and wouldn't recognize one if it flew directly into their primary viewing port. They had, however, encountered 17,492 distinct species, catalogued them all in the unified index, and developed the sort of intellectual smugness that comes from believing your database contains the answer to literally everything. The ambassador from Earth stood in the observation deck looking decidedly unimpressive, which was putting it mildly. Compared to the hierarchy delegation surrounding him, he resembled a particularly fragile houseplant someone had forgotten to water. The lead diplomat, a towering creature whose species name translated roughly to "we evolved better than you," loomed over him with the casual superiority of someone who had never lost an argument because they simply recalibrated their opponent's definition of victory. "Your physiological specifications are concerning," the alien announced, mandibles clicking in what the translation matrix cheerfully rendered as polite concern, but which any human would recognize as barely disguised contempt. Bone density 43% below acceptable standards. Muscle fiber composition inefficient. Sensory range laughably limited. No natural weapons whatsoever. How does your species manage basic survival? The human smiled, which made several nearby aliens instinctively check their sidearms. Humans had approximately 900 documented smile variations, and the hierarchy had only managed to catalog 873 of them. This particular smile didn't match any entry in the database, which was the sort of thing that should have warranted more attention than it received. "We manage," the ambassador said simply, "by hiding behind technological compensations." Obviously, another alien, this one resembling a geometric proof that had achieved sentience and developed opinions, gestured with what might have been a limb. "Your ships are adequate, your weapons functional, your computational systems almost approach standard efficiency. But strip away the machinery, and what remains? Fragile organic matter that barely qualifies as apex predator material." The human appeared to consider this assessment with the sort of thoughtful expression that suggested he was either deeply contemplating the philosophical implications or mentally composing his grocery list. "We do tend to be fragile, yes. Break easily, bruise if you look at us wrong. Terrible environmental tolerances. Need this very specific range of temperature and atmospheric composition, or we just sort of die." Precisely, the geometric alien radiated satisfaction, which is why the integration protocols must establish clear hierarchies. Your species requires overprotection. Guidance from those of us who have achieved more refined evolutionary states. The observation deck held approximately 40 species representatives, and exactly 0 of them appeared to disagree with this assessment. The unified index, after all, had quantified humanity across every measurable metric: strength, speed, sensory acuity, regenerative capabilities, longevity, natural defenses, and the results had been consistently underwhelming. Humans ranked somewhere between "why does this species even exist?" and "how have they not gone extinct already?" on the grand taxonomic scale of galactic importance. "The index is comprehensive," the lead hierarchy diplomat continued, warming to the topic like a professor who had just discovered a captive audience. "Every known phenomenon, every species, every physical law, every anomaly, all documented, categorized, explained. It represents 4 million years of accumulated knowledge from 6,000 contributing civilizations. There are no mysteries anymore, only data awaiting proper classification." "Must be comforting," the human observed, gazing out at the stars with an expression that might have been wistfulness, or might have been something else entirely. The translation matrix couldn't quite parse it, which should have been another warning sign that went universally ignored. Comforting. The word seemed to confuse the geometric alien. It is simply factual. Reality operates according to knowable principles. Document the principles. Understand reality. Your species will learn this. Eventually, perhaps in another few thousand years of development, you might contribute something to the index beyond cautionary tales about inefficient evolution. Laughter rippled through the assembled delegates, rendered in various frequencies and tones but united in their fundamental condescension. The human ambassador accepted this response with admirable composure, which several aliens interpreted as dignity and several others interpreted as lack of understanding. None of them interpreted it as what it actually was: which would prove problematic in approximately 48 hours. Tell me, the human said casually, as though inquiring about the weather rather than challenging the foundational philosophy of 4,000 civilizations. Has the index ever encountered something it couldn't catalog? The question produced the sort of silence generally reserved for moments when someone has committed a profound social error, but nobody wants to be the first to point it out. The lead diplomat's chromatic display shifted through several colors that the translation matrix tagged as confusion, amusement, and second-hand embarrassment for the primitive asking stupid questions. That scenario is definitionally impossible, the geometric alien explained with exaggerated patience. If something exists, it can be measured. If it can be measured, it can be documented. It can be understood. This is fundamental logic. Right, fundamental logic. The human nodded agreeably. And what about things that exist outside your measurement parameters? Nothing exists outside measurable parameters. That would be contradiction in terms, would it? The hierarchy diplomat's chromatic display cycled to a shade that indicated done with this conversation. Ambassador, your species' philosophical traditions are noted in the index under primitive thought systems awaiting correction. I suggest you review the relevant entries before attempting to challenge frameworks that have functioned successfully for longer than your civilization has practiced agriculture. Oh, I've read the entries, the human assured him. Very thorough, impressively comprehensive. You've really thought of everything. We have. Almost everything. The diplomat's sensory stalks twitched. Meaning, just, that there are things in this universe that don't particularly care about being catalogued. The human smile returned, still unclassified. Things that move in the spaces between your measurements. Things that exist precisely because they can't be quantified, defined, or filed away in any database, no matter how comprehensive. Superstition, the geometric alien declared flatly. Primitive fear of the unknown, maintained only because your species lacks the technological sophistication to eliminate mystery from your worldview. Maybe, the human conceded, or maybe the unknown is bigger than any database could hold, and some mysteries prefer to stay mysterious. This statement generated another round of laughter, more condescending than before. The lead hierarchy diplomat made a gesture that the translation matrix rendered as dismissed with prejudice, and turned away to discuss more important matters with delegates whose species had achieved respectable evolutionary standards. The human remained at the observation port, watching the stars with that same unreadable expression, while behind him the representatives of 4,000 civilizations congratulated themselves on their intellectual superiority and comprehensive understanding of all knowable phenomena. The endless prospect continued its voyage toward the joint research facility on the Rim territories, where humanity and the hierarchy would conduct collaborative experiments in the spirit of mutual understanding, and definitely not mutual suspicion. In approximately 48 hours, every single assumption currently held by the assembled delegates would require significant revision. The unified index, that grand repository of all catalogued knowledge, was about to encounter its first truly uncataloguable phenomenon, and the human ambassador, fragile and weak and thoroughly dismissed, knew exactly what was coming. He just hadn't mentioned it, because honestly, where would you even start explaining shadows that moved on their own? Claude can make mistakes. Please double-check responses. The research station clung to the moon's surface like an ambitious barnacle that had read too many engineering journals and developed delusions of architectural grandeur. Officially designated Outpost Theta 7, unofficially called that place where nothing interesting ever happens, by its rotation crew, the facility represented the hierarchy's commitment to collaborative scientific advancement, which meant the aliens operated the important equipment while humans cleaned things, and occasionally got asked to retrieve items from high shelves, despite being shorter than most species present. The irony was apparently lost on everyone except the humans, who found it hilarious. The main laboratory sprawled across 3 levels of meticulously organized research stations, each one monitoring a different aspect of spatial phenomena that the unified index had flagged as worthy of documentation. The hierarchy scientists moved between stations with the confident efficiency of people who had never encountered a problem their database couldn't solve. They barely noticed the human technicians moving quietly through the facility, performing maintenance tasks deemed too menial for advanced civilization. Atmospheric processes, functioning at optimal efficiency, announced one scientist, a being whose species had evolved past the need for names and now identified themselves through complex pheromone signatures that smelled to human noses distinctly like old cheese. Gravitational stabilizers, maintaining perfect equilibrium. Power distribution networks operating within acceptable parameters. All systems performing exactly as the index predicted they would. Shocking, muttered one human technician to another while recalibrating a cooling unit. Equipment performs to specifications. Stop the presses. Alert the media. The other technician, currently elbow-deep in a conduit junction, snorted quietly. Did you notice the shadows in Corridor 9 this morning? Yeah, they're early. Should we mention it? To who? The people who think everything worth knowing is already in their database. That'll go well. Their conversation went unnoticed by the hierarchy scientists, who were far too engaged with their instruments to pay attention to human chatter. This was the kind of oversight that typically preceded phrases like "in retrospect" and "how are we supposed to know" in incident reports. The power fluctuations started small, just a brief dimming of the overhead illumination, barely noticeable, the sort of thing that happens in any facility and means absolutely nothing except that it happened. Except then it happened again, longer this time, and several monitoring stations emitted questioning chirps as their readings momentarily destabilized before returning to normal. The lead scientist, a crystalline entity whose thought processes were literally transparent, which made lying impossible but smugness unavoidable, rotated toward the nearest power distribution panel. Anomaly detected. Running diagnostic protocol. The diagnostic protocols, naturally, consulted the unified index for any documented instances of power fluctuation matching the observed parameters. The index returned 47,000 relevant entries, complete with causes, effects, and recommended solutions. None of them mentioned shadows. Simple voltage variance, the crystalline scientist announced. Correcting now. The correction did absolutely nothing, because voltage had nothing to do with the problem. The lights dimmed again, and this time they stayed dim for a full 10 seconds. In the reduced illumination, something peculiar happened that should have been impossible, according to several fundamental laws of physics, that the hierarchy had documented very thoroughly approximately 800,000 years ago. The shadows moved, not the way shadows move when light sources shift, not the gradual transition of darkness across surfaces as angles change. These shadows moved independently, sliding across walls and floors with deliberate intention, pooling in corners that should have been well illuminated, stretching toward the ceiling despite light sources positioned directly overhead. One alien scientist, whose sensory organs could detect 17 different wavelengths of electromagnetic energy, focused all of them on the nearest shadow, scanning for composition, initiating full spectrum analysis. The instruments returned nothing, not nothing measurable, literally nothing, as though the shadows were holes in reality where data refused to exist. The scientist recalibrated the sensors, ran the scan again, and received the same absence of information. This was, according to the unified index, possible. Matter had composition, energy had signatures, even exotic phenomena, like dark matter or quantum foam left detectable traces, but these shadows produced readings equivalent to scanning a philosophical concept. Database query. The crystalline scientist command. Search parameters. Independent shadow movement. Non-responsive to light source manipulation. No detectable composition. The unified index, containing 4 million years of accumulated knowledge from 6,000 civilizations, searched its comprehensive archives, and returned a single response that had never appeared in its entire operational history. No matching entries. The scientists stared at this result with the sort of profound confusion generally reserved for discovering that basic mathematics had suddenly stopped working. The unified index didn't fail to find matches. That was the entire point of having a unified index. Reality operated according to knowable principles, and the index knew all the principles. Expand search parameters, another scientist suggested, mandibles clicking nervously. Include all documented shadow-related phenomena, all recorded anomalies involving darkness manipulation, all instances of sensor-resistant materials. The index searched again, its vast computational networks, analyzing trillions of data points across thousands of categories. The response remained unchanged. No matching entries found. Meanwhile, the humans continued working, checking equipment and adjusting systems with the sort of calm efficiency that suggested they were dealing with a minor inconvenience, rather than a complete breakdown of documented physical law. One technician, noticing an alien scientist's growing panic, offered helpfully, "You might want to step back from that wall." "Why?" the scientist demanded. "What is happening?
What are these phenomena? They're just shadows, the human said with a shrug. They do this sometimes. Shadows do not do this. Shadows are absence of light caused by object obstruction of electromagnetic irradiation. They do not move independently. They do not resist analysis. They do not exist outside documented parameters. Sure they don't, the human agreed pleasantly, in the tone of someone who had learned that arguing with religious fundamentalists about their dogma was a waste of everyone's time. The shadows continued pooling, gathering in corners and along walls, and now they were definitely, unambiguously moving in ways that had nothing to do with the stuttering lights overhead. They flowed like liquid, climbed like vines, spread like ink dropped in water. Several monitoring stations went completely dark as shadows passed over them, not because the equipment failed, but because the shadows simply absorbed the light around them without bothering to explain themselves to any sensors. The geometric scientist from the Endless Prospect had arrived at the station 3 hours earlier, and was now experiencing the unique cognitive dissonance of watching impossible things happen directly in front of sensory organs that specialized in detecting impossible things. This violates Index Entry 773492 regarding shadow behavior, and Entry 921855 regarding matter-energy interactions, and Entry 44411 regarding, maybe, interrupted a human technician. The index doesn't know everything. The statement produced immediate outrage from every hierarchy scientist in the laboratory. The index knew everything knowable. That was its function, its purpose, its entire reason for existing. Suggesting otherwise was like suggesting that mathematics might occasionally decide that 2 plus 2 equaled something other than 4 just for variety. But the shadows kept moving, kept defying analysis, kept existing in ways that no database entry could adequately explain. And the humans kept working, kept maintaining their equipment, kept acting like reality hadn't just violated its own operating instruction, which was somehow more unsettling than the shadows themselves, because it suggested they had encountered this before, and learned to accept it instead of cataloging it. The lead crystalline scientist made a decision that would later be analyzed extensively in incident report. Activate containment protocols. If these phenomena cannot be documented, they must be isolated until proper analysis becomes possible. Energy barriers sprang up around the areas where shadows had pooled most densely, standard containment fields that could hold superheated plasma or exotic matter with equal efficiency. The shadows paused for approximately 3 seconds, as though considering this development, then flowed directly through the barriers, as if they weren't there, which according to 17 different index entries about containment field functionality, was completely impossible. A human technician watched this development and sighed. Yeah, that's not going to work. Why not? Demanded the geometric scientist, whose entire worldview was currently experiencing several critical errors. Energy barriers are impermeable to all known matter states. Sure, the human agreed. All known matter state. The scientist processed this statement, cross-referenced it with 14,000 index entries about matter classification, and arrived at a conclusion that contradicted everything their civilization had built over millions of years of advance. Before they could articulate this conclusion, however, the shadows began doing something new. They started coalescing.
The shadows stopped being abstract oddities, violating physical law, and started becoming something far worse. Shapes, with intention. They gathered in the center of the laboratory, pulling together from corners and walls and ceiling, flowing into a concentration of darkness that had no business existing in a room with functional lighting. The hierarchy scientists backed away instinctively, which was remarkable considering most of their species had evolved past the concept of fear, approximately 2 million years ago. Apparently fear, like shadows, didn't particularly care about being catalogued out of existence. Weapons, the crystalline scientist commanded, and immediately 3 security personnel materialized with devices that could theoretically disintegrate anything from armored plating to hostile life forms, to particularly stubborn philosophical arguments. They aimed at the coalescing shadows and fired, unleashing energy bursts that had been calculated, tested, and index verified to be effective against literally everything. The energy passed straight through the shadows without slowing down, impacted the far wall, and left scorch marks that would require paperwork later. The shadows remained completely unaffected, continuing their gathering process as though the most advanced weapons technology in the galaxy had been nothing more than mildly warm air currents. Impossible, whispered the geometric scientist. running probability calculations that kept returning errors. Energy discharge of that magnitude should produce measurable interaction with any matter configuration. The index contains no entries for material that exhibits complete energy transparency while maintaining cohesive form. Yeah, said a human technician, leaning against a workstation with the casual posture of someone watching a mildly interesting weather pattern. That's kind of their whole thing. The shadows finished coalescing into what could generously be called a shape and less generously be called a migraine given physical manifestation. It resembled nothing in particular, and everything simultaneously, existing in that uncomfortable space between definition and chaos that made pattern recognition systems cry. Tendrils extended from the central mass, not exactly solid, but not exactly not solid either, exploring the space around them with what could only be interpreted as curiosity. Every sensor in the laboratory focused on the shape, desperate for any data point that would make sense of what they were observing. Electromagnetic scanners found nothing. Gravitational sensors detected no mass. Thermal imaging registered no temperature differential. Quantum analyzers gave readings equivalent to asking a fish about mountain climbing. The shape existed in defiance of measurement itself, which was philosophically intriguing and practically terrifying. The doors to the laboratory opened, and the human ambassador from the Endless Prospect walked in looking remarkably unconcerned for someone entering a room full of panicking aliens and physics-defying shadow entities. He carried 2 containers of what appeared to be coffee, which seemed like an odd priority given current circumstances, but humans had always had peculiar approaches to crisis management. "Morning," he said pleasantly to the shadow shape, which pulsed in a manner that might have been acknowledgement or might have been preparation to consume everyone present. The translation matrix, already overworked trying to make sense of the situation, declined to offer an interpretation. The lead crystalline scientist rotated toward the ambassador with every sensory organ focused to maximum intensity. "You can communicate with this phenomenon." "Communicate is a strong word," the human replied, setting down one coffee container near the shadow shape, which extended a tendril toward it with apparent interest. "We more sort of coexist. They've been around Earth for a long time, longer than we have actually. Probably longer than most species in this room have existed, but time gets weird when you're talking about things that don't experience it linearly. The index contains no records of shadow entities on Earth," the geometric scientist protested. "We conducted comprehensive surveys of your planet, full spectrum analysis, deep scans, historical record verification. Nothing like this appeared in any data." "Right, because they don't appear in data." The ambassador sipped his coffee with the calm of someone explaining why water is wet. "That's what I tried mentioning on the ship. Some things exist outside your measurement parameters, not because they're hiding, but because they're fundamentally incompatible with being measured." The shadow shape had apparently decided the coffee container was interesting, because it wrapped tendrils around it and pulled it into its central mass, where it disappeared completely. Whether this constituted drinking or consumption or transportation to another dimension was unclear, but the container was definitely gone. "How is your species aware of these entities if they cannot be documented?" demanded the crystalline scientist, whose thought processes were currently experiencing cascading failures as each fundamental assumption about reality proved incorrect. "Because we encountered them about 300 years ago, and had to figure out how to deal with them without trying to catalog everything to death." The humans settled against a workstation, apparently prepared to deliver a history lesson while surrounded by impossible phenomena. They started appearing during early industrialization, factories, power plants, anywhere humans generated significant energy and light. They'd show up in the shadows, move around, sometimes interact with people, scared everyone initially. "Naturally, your historical records contain no mention of this," another scientist interjected. "Our official historical records don't. No. Turns out when you document something in detail, try to study it scientifically, attempt to capture and analyze it, they leave, just vanish completely. They only stick around when you acknowledge their existence without trying to explain it. It's like they exist specifically in the space between knowing and understand." The shadow shape pulsed again, several tendrils extending toward the monitoring equipment that was still fruitlessly attempting to scan it. Instruments went dark as the tendrils touched them, not damaged, but simply rendered non-functional, as though the shadows carried an anti-information field that negated any attempt to document. "This is illogical," the geometric scientist declared, their voice carrying an edge that the translation matrix tagged as existential distress. Intelligence requires structure. Existence requires measurable properties. Consciousness requires biological or synthetic substrate. These entities possess none of these requirements yet demonstrate intentional behavior. The contradiction is absolute. Only if you assume your database defines the boundaries of possible existence, the human pointed out, which, and I'm just spitballing here, might be a tiny bit arrogant. Every hierarchy representative in the laboratory experienced the unique sensation of having their entire civilization's philosophical foundation questioned by a species they had dismissed as primitive barely 2 days earlier. It was not a comfortable feeling. Several of them instinctively checked the unified index for entries on coping with fundamental worldview collapse, but the index had been designed by people who had never anticipated needing such entries. How does your species coexist with entities that cannot be understood? The lead scientist asked. And for the first time since humanity had made contact with galactic civilization, the question contained no condescension, just genuine confusion from beings whose entire culture was built on the principle that understanding was always possible. We acknowledge, make space for them. Don't try to force them into categories they were never meant to fit. The ambassador gestured toward the shadow shape which had extended tendrils across half the ceiling, and was apparently examining the light fixtures with what might have been amusement. They're not hostile. They don't want anything from us. They just exist, and sometimes they like being around humans because we stop trying to make them make sense. But how do you interact with something that defies all principles of interaction? The crystalline scientist's transparency was currently displaying thought patterns that resembled a computer trying to divide by zero. How do you establish communication protocols? How do you predict behavior? How do you ensure safety? We don't, really. We just learn to be okay with not knowing everything. The human smiled that unclassified smile again. Turns out that's the thing about humans. We're weak, fragile, barely qualified as apex predators. You made all those points very clearly on the ship. But we're adaptable. We can accept mysteries without needing to solve them. We can coexist with the inexplicable without having a panic attack about it. The shadow shape had apparently finished its examination of the ceiling, and was now flowing back toward the center of the laboratory, consolidating into a form that might have been contemplative if contemplation could be expressed through animate darkness. Several tendrils extended toward various hierarchy scientists, who flinched backward despite their species having evolved past reflexive fear responses. The shadows paused, retracted slightly, and pulsed in a pattern that somehow conveyed amusement without making any sound or movement that could be classified as communication. They think you're funny, the human translated, though how he derived this interpretation from shapeless darkness was unclear. All your technology, all your databases, all your certainty about how reality works, and you can't handle something that just exists without permission. We require explanations, the geometric scientist insisted weakly. We require data. We require entries in the index. Without documentation, how do we incorporate these entities into our understanding of the universe? You don't. The ambassador said simply. That's what I've been trying to explain. Not everything needs to be incorporated, documented, or understood. Some things just are, and forcing them into your frameworks would destroy what makes them what they are. The shadow shape pulsed one final time, tendrils spreading across the laboratory in a gesture that might have been farewell or might have been satisfaction at making its point. Then it began dissolving, flowing back into corners and edges, dispersing across surfaces until it looked like nothing more than ordinary shadows cast by ordinary light. Within 30 seconds there was no evidence that anything unusual had occurred except for the missing coffee container and the existential crisis currently being experienced by every hierarchy scientist present. The monitoring equipment flickered back to life, resumed normal function, and displayed readings indicating that absolutely nothing anomalous was currently present. The index, when queried again, still returned NO matching entries, but now the absence felt less like a failure, and more like an admission. The silence that followed the shadow's departure carried the particular quality of a room full of people realizing their entire education had missed something fundamental. The hierarchy scientists stood motionless, running internal diagnostics on their own thought processes, cross-referencing their observations with the unified index, and arriving repeatedly at the same unsatisfying conclusion. They had witnessed something that should not exist, and the fact that it existed anyway meant either reality was broken or their understanding of reality was broken,
and the second option was significantly more disturbing than the first. The lead crystalline scientist, whose transparent thought processes were currently displaying what could only be described as computational whimpering, finally addressed the human ambassador. Your species has coexisted with these entities for 3 centuries, give or take, the human confirmed, finishing his coffee with the casual manner of someone who had not just facilitated the complete demolition of several civilizations' foundational philosophies, and in that time, you have made no attempts to catalog them, document, incorporate them into any scientific framework. Oh, we tried initially, didn't go well. The ambassador gestured vaguely at the now ordinary-looking shadows. Every time we set up instruments, established observation protocols, tried to apply scientific methodology, they'd disappear completely, for months, sometimes. Eventually we figured out they were teaching us something. Teaching you what? Demanded the geometric scientist, whose form was displaying stress patterns that suggested their structural integrity was experiencing philosophical pressure. That knowledge is futile. That understanding is impossible. That 4 million years of accumulated wisdom across 6,000 civilizations means nothing. Teaching us that some things are bigger than our need to explain them. The human set down his empty coffee container with a soft sound that seemed unnaturally loud in the quiet laboratory. Your civilization built the unified index because you needed certainty. You needed to believe that everything could be known, measured, that if you just gathered enough data, reality would stop having mysteries. And that worked fine until you encountered something that exists specifically because it cannot be cataloged. The crystalline scientists' thought patterns spiraled through several complex configurations before settling on something resembling reluctant curiosity. How does your species function without comprehensive documentation? How do you advance technologically? How do you build upon previous knowledge if you accept that some phenomena cannot be understood? We still document what can be documented. We still pursue understanding where understanding is possible. We just stopped assuming that everything falls into that category. The ambassador moved toward one of the monitoring stations, where instruments were displaying perfectly normal readings, despite having been completely non-functional minutes earlier. Humans have always lived with contradiction. We develop sophisticated technology, while knowing we will never fully understand consciousness. We build civilizations while accepting that individual behavior remains unpredictable. We love people we cannot fully know. Mystery is native to our experience. That sounds exhausting, observed another scientist, a multi-limbed being whose species had eliminated uncertainty from their existence approximately 800,000 years ago, and had been very proud of this achievement. Sometimes the human admit, but it also means we are not completely devastated when our databases fail to explain something. We have practiced dealing with the unexplainable. The geometric scientist made a sound that the translation matrix struggled with before settling on distressed geometric recalculation. The unified index represents our civilization's greatest achievement, 4 million years of accumulated knowledge, the combined wisdom of 6,000 species. And you are suggesting it is fundamentally limited, not limited, just incomplete, and always will be. The ambassador's tone carried no triumph, no smugness, just simple statement of fact. You built a database that catalogs the catalogable. That is genuinely impressive. But then you made the mistake of assuming the catalogable was everything that exists. The shadows are just the most obvious example of what you missed. What else did we miss? The crystalline scientist's question came out quieter than intended, which was remarkable for a being who communicated through controlled light refraction. Honestly, probably more than either of us. The human smiled, and this time the smile was gentle rather than unclassified. The universe is bigger than any framework, always has been, always will be. You can spend another 4 million years adding to your index, and there will still be phenomena that refuse to be filed away. Things that exist in the spaces between your categories, entities that function according to principles that contradict your documented laws. The assembled scientists processed this information with varying degrees of acceptance. Some began immediately formulating proposals for index expansion that could somehow accommodate non-catalogable phenomena, which rather missed the point but demonstrated admirable persistence. Others stood in contemplative silence, running calculations that consistently returned philosophical errors. A few appeared to be experiencing the cognitive equivalent of a system reboot, their entire worldview requiring fundamental reconstruction. You called us weak on the ship, the human continued, addressing the room generally. Physically fragile, evolutionarily inadequate, technologically inferior, and by your metrics, all of that was accurate. But you missed the strength that comes from accepting weakness. You missed the adaptability that comes from acknowledging limitation. You missed the wisdom that comes from knowing you do not and cannot know everything. The lead crystalline scientist's thought patterns finally stabilized into something resembling acceptance. Though the color was several shades darker than usual, your species was not intimidated by our superiority, because you were already comfortable with things being superior to you, with forces beyond your understanding, with mysteries you cannot solve, pretty much. The ambassador glanced toward a corner where shadows pooled in completely ordinary ways that might or might not indicate continued observation by entities that refuse definition. We have been sharing our planet with inexplicable phenomena since before we developed language. Gods, spirits, shadows that move on their own. We have always known there were things beyond human comprehension. Building technology and civilization did not change. We just got better tools for dealing with the explicable while maintaining respect for the inexplicable. The hierarchy will need to reconsider fundamental operational protocols, the geometric scientist said slowly, each word carrying the weight of civilizational restructure. If the index cannot account for all phenomena, then our entire approach to reality requires revision. Or, the human suggested carefully, you could just accept that some things do not need to be included in your index. They can exist alongside. You can acknowledge them without cataloging them. You can be aware of their presence without requiring them to submit documentation. This concept produced visible distress among several scientists, whose species had been eliminating ambiguity from their existence for so long that accepting it back felt like evolutionary regression. But others, particularly those who had directly observed the shadow entity's complete indifference to the most advanced analysis technology in the galaxy, appeared to be cautiously considering the possibility that maybe perhaps potentially the universe might contain things that were meant to remain unexplained. The human ambassador prepared to leave the laboratory, having delivered his unintentional lesson in epistemological humility to beings who had not realized they needed one. Before departing, he turned back to address the assembled scientists one final time. The shadows will probably visit again, maybe here, maybe other facilities, maybe your home worlds eventually. They seem to like going places where people are very certain about how reality works. Just to remind everyone that certainty has limits, my advice, do not try to capture them, do not try to study them, do not create new index entries attempting to classify, just acknowledge their existence, and continue with your work. They are not problems requiring solutions, they are simply neighbors who refuse to fill out census form. He left and the hierarchy scientists remained in the laboratory surrounded by their instruments and their documentation and their comprehensive database that had just been revealed as fundamentally incomplete. Outside, through the observation ports, stars burned with light that created shadows, and those shadows moved in ways that monitoring equipment would never successfully explain. And somewhere in the gaps between measurement and mystery, entities that refused to be catalogued continued existing exactly as they always had. The unified index, 4 million years of accumulated knowledge, representative of 6,000 civilizations' combined wisdom, would never contain an entry for shadow entities that moved independent, not because such an entry was impossible to create, but because creating it would miss the entire point. Some phenomena existed specifically to remind advanced civilizations that advancement had limits, that knowledge had boundaries, that understanding was not the same as control, and humanity, weak and fragile and laughably primitive by every quantifiable metric, had learned this lesson centuries ago, simply by accepting that shadows sometimes moved and that was fine, actually, and maybe not everything needed an explanation to be real. It was, in retrospect, exactly the kind of wisdom you would expect from a species that had spent its entire existence surrounded by mysteries and had responded not with conquest but with coexistence. The hierarchy scientists eventually returned to their work. Though their approach now carried a certain humility that had been absent before, they would continue building their index, documenting what could be documented, but with the uncomfortable awareness that their database, no matter how comprehensive, would always be missing entries for the things that mattered most, the things that moved in shadow, the things that existed between categories, the things that refused to be known because being known would make them something less than what they were. And in the corners of the laboratory, shadows pooled in ways that might have been ordinary or might have been something else entirely, and the monitoring equipment displayed normal readings, and nobody tried to investigate further, because sometimes the wisest thing advanced civilization can do is admit it has reached the edges of advancement, and learn to be comfortable with what lies beyond.